The crystal chandeliers of Lady Pemberton's autumn assembly blazed with 1,000 candles, casting honeyed light upon silk gowns and jewelled throats. Yet for all the warmth that gilded the grand ballroom, no flame could thaw the frost that settled upon Evelina Harcourt the moment she crossed the threshold. Whispers rippled through the gathered company like wind through dead leaves, and the rustling of fans became a language of contempt. She had learned to translate their gestures with bitter fluency, the sideways glance, the raised brow, the deliberate turn of a shoulder. Each told the same tale. She was tolerated, not treasured, permitted, not prized. Her gown, a pale dove-grey silk inherited from her mother's wardrobe, had been mended twice at the hem. The lace at her sleeves, though delicate, bore the faint yellowing of age. She wore no jewels save for the single strand of pearls clasped about her throat, a relic of better days, when her father's name had opened doors rather than closed them. Now his ruin was her inheritance. The bankruptcy had stripped the Harcourt family of fortune, of standing, of future. What remained was a pretty face and a proud spine, neither of which paid debts or secured invitations. Evelina moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her chin lifted as though she bore a crown rather than shame. She would not grant them the satisfaction of her tears, yet the invisible walls closed in with every step. Matrons turned their backs. Young ladies tittered behind gloved hands. Gentlemen looked past her as though she were a ghost, haunting the margins of their merriment. "She brings nothing but a pretty face," Lady Rowena Blythe murmured to her circle, her voice pitched to carry. The words sliced through the music, sharp and deliberate. One wonders why she persists in these appearances. Surely even desperation has its limits. Laughter followed, bright and cruel. Evelina's fingers tightened upon her mother's pearls, seeking the comfort of their smooth, familiar weight. She did not look toward Lady Rowena, though every instinct screamed to meet those venomous green eyes. Instead, she moved toward the refuge of the refreshment table, where at least she might occupy her hands with a glass of cordial and pretend she had come for the refreshment rather than the futile hope of acceptance. But refuge was not to be granted. As she reached for a crystal goblet, Lord Thaddeus Marlowe, a young baron of middling fortune and infinite arrogance, stepped deliberately into her path. His boot caught the hem of her gown. The fabric tore with a sickening whisper of ruin. Evelina stumbled, catching herself against the table's edge. The goblet fell, shattering upon the parquet floor in a spray of shards and crimson liquid that bloomed like blood across the polished wood. The ballroom stilled. Every eye turned toward her. The musicians faltered, their bows dragging discordant notes from the strings before falling silent altogether. Evelina's cheeks burned with mortification as she stood frozen, her ruined hem pooling at her feet, the broken glass glittering like accusations around her slippers. "Oh, dear Miss Harcourt," Lord Marlowe drawled, his smile a blade wrapped in velvet. "How terribly clumsy of you. One would think a lady of your reduced circumstances might take greater care with borrowed finery." The laughter that followed was louder now, emboldened by her visible distress. Lady Rowena's fan snapped open with a sharp crack, hiding her smile but not the triumph in her eyes. Evelina felt the tears gather, hot and hateful, at the corners of her vision. She would not weep. She would not grant them even that small victory. But her throat closed and her hands trembled, and the weight of every humiliation she had endured since her father's death pressed down upon her shoulders until she thought she might simply crumble there among the crystal shards. She drew breath to speak, to apologize, to flee, to somehow salvage what remained of her tattered dignity, when a voice cleaved through the silence like a blade through silk. "Who dares to laugh at the woman who shall dance with me this night?" The words were not shouted. They required no volume to command. Every soul in that ballroom turned as one toward the speaker, and the laughter died as swiftly as a candle snuffed between finger and thumb. Adrian Davenforth, Duke of Ravenshade, stood at the entrance to the ballroom. He had not been announced. No footman had proclaimed his arrival, yet his presence was a proclamation unto itself. Tall and imposing in black evening dress that seemed to drink the candlelight, he surveyed the assembly with eyes of winter grey, eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. His dark hair was swept back from a face carved in aristocratic lines, high cheekbones, a jaw hewn from granite, a mouth that rarely curved in mirth. He wore wealth and power as other men wore cologne, an invisible mantle that made even the highest-born lord feel suddenly inadequate. He moved forward with the measured tread of a man who had never in his life been denied. The crowd parted before him as the sea before Moses. His gaze, unwavering and cold as frosted iron, fixed upon Evelina, where she stood trembling amid the ruin of her dignity. For a single, breathless moment, she thought he would pass by, that even he, in his terrible grandeur, had come merely to witness her disgrace, but he did not pass by. He stopped before her, so close that she could see the fine weave of his cravat, the glint of platinum cufflinks at his wrists. He extended one gloved hand toward her, palm upturned in invitation. The gesture was economical, almost curt, yet the command implicit within it brooked no refusal. "Miss Harcourt," he said, his voice low and measured, "I believe the next waltz is mine." The ballroom held its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a clock began to chime the hour. Evelina looked up into those merciless grey eyes and saw nothing of pity there, nothing of kindness, only an inscrutable intensity that made her heart lurch against her ribs. She placed her trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, firm and unyielding. He led her toward the center of the ballroom, and the crowd fell back as though pressed by an invisible tide. The musicians, startled from their stupor, lifted their instruments once more. The first strains of the waltz drifted through the air, tentative at first, then gathering strength. Adrian drew her into the dance with the precision of a man who did nothing carelessly. His hand at her waist was proper, yet she felt the heat of it through the thin silk of her gown. They turned together beneath the chandeliers, and the world narrowed to the space between them. Evelina dared not speak. She scarcely dared to breathe. Around them, the assembly watched in stunned silence. Lady Rowena's fan had fallen closed. Lord Marlowe's smile had curdled into something very like fear. The Duke of Ravenshade danced with the woman they had scorned, and in doing so, he had rewritten the hierarchy of that glittering room with a single devastating gesture. When the waltz concluded, Adrian released her hand with the same deliberate care with which he had claimed it. He inclined his head in a bow so slight it might have been imagined, then turned and walked from the ballroom without a backward glance. Evelina stood alone once more. But she was no longer the woman who had stumbled over broken glass. The room trembled with unspoken questions. The clock struck its final chime, and in the silence that followed, Evelina touched the pearls at her throat and realized that everything had changed. The door closed behind the Duke. The whispers began anew. The morning broke grey and sullen over London, the fog rolling through the streets like a living thing. Evelina woke in the narrow chamber of her aunt's townhouse, the chill air seeping through the thin curtains. She lay still for a moment, staring at the water-stained ceiling, wondering if the events of the previous evening had been some fevered dream conjured by desperation. But the ruined gown lay draped over the chair by the window, the torn hem a testament to her humiliation and to what had followed. She rose and dressed with care, choosing a simple morning gown of pale blue muslin. Her aunt, Lady Margot Harcourt, had already breakfasted and departed for her morning calls, leaving Evelina to the companionship of cold toast and yesterday's tea. The house, small and shabby genteel, bore the marks of economical living: faded wallpaper, worn carpets, a single maid-of-all-work who answered both door and kitchen with equal resentment. It was a far cry from the manor where Evelina had spent her childhood, but it was shelter nonetheless, and she was grateful for even that grudging charity. She had just settled in the cramped morning room with a book, a novel borrowed from the lending library, its pages soft with many readings, when the knocker sounded at the front door. Sharp, decisive, 3 precise raps that echoed through the narrow hall. Evelina glanced up, expecting a tradesman or perhaps one of her aunt's few remaining acquaintances. Instead, she heard the maid's startled gasp, followed by the rustle of heavy fabric and the measured tread of boots upon the threshold. His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshade, to see Miss Harcourt. The words fell into the morning room like stones into still water. Evelina's book slipped from her fingers. She rose on unsteady legs, her heart hammering against her stays. This was impossible. Dukes did not call upon impoverished young women in shabby townhouses, certainly not dukes of Adrian Davenport's consequence. Yet when she reached the narrow entrance hall, there he stood, filling the modest space with his presence as surely as a lion might fill a birdcage. He had removed his hat and gloves, handing them to the bewildered maid with the same detached courtesy one might show a footman. His greatcoat, dark and perfectly tailored, bore the faint damp of the fog. He turned as Evelina appeared, his grey eyes sweeping over her with an assessing gaze that missed nothing. She was acutely aware of the threadbare rug beneath her feet, the peeling paint upon the walls, the faint smell of yesterday's cabbage that no amount of lavender water could quite disguise. "Your Grace," she managed, dropping into a curtsy that felt absurdly formal in such surroundings. I did not expect—" "No," he agreed, his voice carrying that same measured quality she remembered from the ballroom. "I imagine you did not." He paused, glancing toward the morning room. "Might we speak privately, Miss Harcourt?" I assure you my intentions are entirely proper, though I suspect my presence here will cause no small measure of speculation regardless. Evelina's mind whirled. Refuse him? Unthinkable. Invite him into her aunt's shabby parlor. Mortifying. But what choice did she have? She nodded, gesturing toward the morning room, and preceded him through the doorway. He followed, his tall frame seeming to shrink the already small space. She did not offer him tea. They both knew there was no proper tea service to offer. "Forgive me," she said, clasping her hands before her to still their trembling. "We do not often receive callers of your station. I fear I am ill-prepared to offer the hospitality such a visit would ordinarily require." "I have not come for hospitality," Adrian replied. He remained standing, his back to the window, the grey light casting his features into shadow. "I have come to discuss a matter of some delicacy. Last evening, I made a public gesture on your behalf. I do not act carelessly, Miss Harcourt, nor do I invite misunderstanding, but I am aware that my actions have placed you in a position that may prove complicated." "Complicated," Evelina echoed, a bitter smile touching her lips. "That is a generous term for what awaits me, Your Grace. I am certain that by this afternoon, every drawing room in Mayfair will be abuzz with speculation regarding your motives. Some will assume I have somehow ensnared you through artifice. Others will suggest you have taken pity upon a fallen woman. Neither interpretation will improve my standing." "Then let us provide them with a third interpretation," Adrian said. His tone did not shift, but something in his gaze sharpened. "One that serves both our purposes and silences the gossips more effectively than denial ever could." Evelina stared at him, confusion warring with a dawning, impossible suspicion. "I do not understand, Your Grace." "I am proposing," he said, each word deliberate and clear, "a marriage of convenience. You require protection from the cruelty of society and the security that a respectable alliance would provide. I require..." He paused, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his austere features. "I require a wife. Not for affection, I have no use for romantic entanglements, but for the practical considerations that attend a man of my position. Heirs, a hostess for my estates, the appearance of domestic stability. You are educated, well-mannered, and possess the bearing of your former station. Your lack of fortune is no impediment to me. Indeed, it may be an advantage. You will have no family to make demands, no dowry to complicate negotiations." The word struck her like a blow. For a moment, Evelina could not breathe. Marriage. To the Duke of Ravenshade. It was absurd, impossible, and yet he stood before her, his expression as impassive as carved marble, awaiting her response with the patience of a man accustomed to having his proposals accepted. "You speak of marriage as though it were a business contract," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper, "as though affection, partnership, even basic regard were immaterial." "Because they are," Adrian replied without hesitation. "I do not seek a love match, Miss Harcourt. I seek an arrangement that benefits us both. You gain status, security, and protection from those who would see you humiliated. I gain a duchess who understands her role and will not burden me with expectations I have no intention of fulfilling. It is a fair exchange." "Fair," Evelina repeated. The word tasted of ash. She turned away from him, moving toward the window, though she saw nothing of the fog-shrouded street beyond. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, pale and insubstantial. "And if I refuse?" "Then you refuse," Adrian said. "I will not press you. But I would ask you to consider your alternatives, Miss Harcourt. Your aunt's charity will not last forever. You have no fortune, no prospects, and after last night, your reputation hangs by the slenderest thread. One more scandal, one more public humiliation, and you will find yourself beyond the pale entirely. I offer you a way out. I suggest you take it." Evelina closed her eyes. She thought of her mother's pearls, the only thing of value she possessed. She thought of her father, broken and ashamed in his final days. She thought of Lady Rowena's laughter, Lord Marlowe's cruelty, the endless parade of slights and snubs she had endured, and she thought of the man standing behind her, offering her salvation wrapped in ice. "I will need time to consider," she said, opening her eyes to meet his reflected gaze in the window. "This is not a decision to be made lightly." "Of course," Adrian agreed, "but do not take too long, Miss Harcourt. London's memory is short, but its appetite for scandal is insatiable. I will call upon you again in 3 days' time. You may give me your answer then." He moved toward the door, pausing on the threshold. "One more thing," he added, his voice softening by the barest degree. "Whatever you decide, you need never fear humiliation in my presence again. That, at least, I can promise you." Then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of sandalwood and the echo of impossible choices in his wake. Evelina sank into the nearest chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily onward. 3 days. She had 3 days to decide whether to trade one form of imprisonment for another. 3 days to choose between pride and survival. The fog pressed against the windows. The house settled around her with a weary sigh. She touched the pearls at her throat and wondered if her mother would understand. The chapel of St. Margaret stood in the older quarter of the city, its grey stone walls streaked with soot and time. Evelina had come seeking solace, or perhaps clarity, something to quiet the tempest raging in her breast since the Duke's astonishing proposal. The interior was dim and cool, lit by banks of votive candles that flickered like captured stars. She sat in a rear pew, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed upon the altar without truly seeing it. The silence pressed down like a benediction or a judgment, she could not tell which. She had not told her aunt of the Duke's visit. Lady Margot would have been insufferable, alternating between raptures at the prospect of such an alliance and dire warnings about the perils of marrying without affection. Evelina needed neither enthusiasm nor caution. What she needed was to understand her own heart, a task that proved more difficult with each passing hour. The door at the rear of the chapel opened with a whisper of hinges. Evelina did not turn, assuming it to be the verger come to tend the candles, but the footsteps that approached were too measured, too deliberate. She glanced over her shoulder and felt her breath catch. Adrian Davenforth moved down the aisle with the same quiet authority he brought to every space he occupied. He wore no greatcoat today, only a dark jacket and buff trousers, his cravat tied with austere precision. He stopped at the end of her pew, his expression unreadable in the uncertain light. "Forgive the intrusion," he said quietly. "Your aunt's maid informed me you had come here. I hoped we might speak before the 3 days elapsed." Evelina's fingers tightened in her lap. "Your Grace, I have not yet reached a decision. I promised you an answer in 3 days, and I intend to honor that promise." "I am not here to press you for an answer," Adrian replied. He moved into the pew, maintaining a careful distance between them. "I am here because I owe you honesty, Miss Harcourt. Last evening I spoke of marriage as though it were merely a transaction. That was unkind. More than that, it was incomplete." She turned to face him fully, surprise loosening the tight grip of anxiety in her chest. "I confess, Your Grace, I did not expect you to reconsider your position." "I have not reconsidered the proposal itself," he said. "But I have reconsidered the manner in which I presented it. You deserve to know why I chose you of all the women in London to receive such an offer." Evelina waited, her heart beating a sharp tattoo against her ribs. The candlelight gilded the hard planes of his face, softening nothing yet somehow rendering him more human than he had seemed in her aunt's shabby parlour. 3 years ago, Adrian began, his voice low and steady, "I was engaged to be married. Lady Catherine Wycliffe, daughter of the Earl of Ashton. It was a match arranged by our families, approved by society, and expected by all who knew us. I believed it would serve adequately. I did not love her, but I respected her intelligence and her breeding. I thought that would be sufficient." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the altar. 2 months before the wedding, I discovered she had been corresponding with another man, not a lover, precisely, but a confidant. Someone to whom she poured out all the doubts and fears she could not share with me. I read one of those letters by accident. In it she wrote that I was the coldest man she had ever known, that she dreaded a lifetime spent in the shadow of my indifference, that she would have refused me if her family had not insisted upon the match. Evelina felt something twist in her chest. "What did you do?" "I released her from the engagement," Adrian said simply. "I told her family that we were not suited, and I bore the brunt of society's speculation. She married her confidant 6 months later. They are, by all accounts, quite happy." He turned back to Evelina, and for the first time, she saw something vulnerable in those grey eyes. "I tell you this not to elicit sympathy, but to explain why I approached you as I did. I have no illusions about my nature, Miss Harcourt. I am not a man built for warmth or easy affection, but I am not without honor. And I find that I cannot in good conscience bind another woman to me without her full understanding of what that bond entails." "You are warning me away," Evelina said softly. "You are telling me that I should refuse you." "I am telling you the truth," Adrian corrected. "What you do with it is your choice. But I will add this. When I saw you standing in that ballroom, humiliated before those vipers, I saw something I recognized. Dignity in the face of cruelty. Strength that refuses to bend even when it has every reason to break. That is rare, Miss Harcourt, rarer than beauty or fortune, and it is worth preserving, even if the means of preservation are imperfect." Evelina looked down at her hands, her mother's pearls catching the light. "You speak as though you are offering me shelter from a storm. But what if, in accepting that shelter, I find myself in a different kind of tempest. Then we weather it together, Adrian said. The words were simple, almost blunt, but they carried a weight that made her look up sharply. I cannot promise you love, Miss Harcourt, but I can promise you partnership, respect, protection. And if that is not the fairy tale you dreamed of as a girl, it is at least honest. The silence that followed stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside, the city rumbled and groaned, oblivious to the small drama unfolding in the shadowed chapel. Evelina felt the world narrowing to this moment, this choice. She thought of her father's shame, her aunt's grudging charity, Lady Rowena's venom, Lord Marlowe's casual cruelty, and she thought of the man before her, offering her not love, but something that might in time prove more durable. If I accept your proposal, she said slowly, I will not be a decorative duchess who smiles and nods and says nothing of consequence. I will not be silent when I disagree with you, nor will I pretend contentment when I feel none. I will be your partner in truth, not merely in name. Can you accept that, Your Grace? A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed across Adrian's features. I would accept nothing less, he said. A silent wife would bore me to distraction. Evelina felt the ghost of a smile touch her lips. Then I have a condition of my own. You say you cannot promise me love. Very well. But I will not marry a man who sees me merely as a convenient solution to a social requirement. If we are to be partners, then I must know that you value me, not for my compliance, but for who I am. Adrian regarded her in silence for a long moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, he extended his hand. I value you, Evelina Harcourt, he said, her given name a strange intimacy on his lips. More than you yet know. And if you grant me the honor of your hand, I will endeavor to prove that value every day of our marriage. She looked at his outstretched hand, strong and ungloved, a gesture of trust, of beginning. She thought of her mother, who had married for love and died broken-hearted. She thought of her father, who had gambled everything and lost. She thought of herself, standing at a crossroads with only her courage and her pride to guide her. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. Yes, she whispered, I will marry you. The candles flickered. The chapel seemed to hold its breath, and in the silence, Evelina felt the weight of her old life fall away, replaced by the unknown promise of the new. Adrian lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was formal, restrained, yet somehow more binding than any passionate declaration. Then we shall face the world together, he said, and let them dare to mock you now. Outside, the bells of St. Margaret's began to toll the hour. The sound rolled through the city, a proclamation and a promise. Evelina rose, her hand still clasped in Adrian's, and together they walked toward the door. The light beyond was grey and uncertain, but they walked into it side by side. The world would have much to say about their union, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelina found she did not care. The announcement appeared in the Morning Post 3 days hence, a scant paragraph nestled between notices of births and military promotions. Yet its impact upon London society was nothing short of cataclysmic. By noon, every drawing-room from Mayfair to Belgravia buzzed with speculation, disbelief, and, among those who had mocked Evelina most viciously, barely concealed rage. His Grace the Duke of Ravenshade has the honour to announce his engagement to Miss Evelina Harcourt, daughter of the late Mr. James Harcourt. The nuptials shall take place at St. George's, Hanover Square, on the 15th of next month. Lady Rowena Blythe read the notice 3 times before hurling the paper into her morning fire. The flames consumed it eagerly, but they could not consume the fury that coursed through her veins like poison. She had set her cap at the Duke for 2 seasons, employing every artifice at her disposal. She had dressed to catch his eye, positioned herself in his path at every social function, laughed at conversations she barely heard in hopes he might glance her way, and he had looked through her as though she were glass. Now he had chosen the Harcourt girl, the penniless nobody, the daughter of scandal and bankruptcy. It was an insult beyond bearing. Lucinda, she called sharply to her lady's maid, bring me my writing desk and summon Lord Fenlo. Tell him I require his counsel on a matter of utmost urgency. Within the hour, Lord Garrick Fenlo arrived at Lady Rowena's townhouse, his expression carefully neutral. He was a man who understood the value of information and the profit in other people's grievances. Tall and impeccably dressed, his dark eyes held the calculating gleam of one perpetually weighing advantage against risk. My lady, he said, bowing over her hand with practiced grace, your summons suggested a matter of some delicacy. I am, as always, at your disposal. Rowena gestured him toward a chair, dismissing the servants with a wave. When they were alone, She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The Duke's engagement is an abomination. That creature has no right to such an elevation, and I intend to see that this wedding never takes place. Fenlo's expression remained carefully blank. Strong words, Lady Rowena. The Duke is not a man to be trifled with. His power extends far beyond the drawing rooms of Mayfair. Which is precisely why we must act carefully, Rowena replied. I do not propose a frontal assault, but there are whispers about James Harcourt's final days, rumours that his bankruptcy was not merely a matter of poor investments, but of deliberate fraud. If such rumours were to gain traction, if evidence were to surface suggesting Miss Harcourt's father embezzled funds from the Crown, then even the Duke would be forced to reconsider. He cannot afford to ally himself with treason, however distant. Fenlo studied her with renewed interest. You have such evidence? Not yet, Rowena admitted. But evidence can be manufactured, can it not? Especially when the man in question is dead and cannot defend himself. I have contacts in the Treasury offices. Clerks who remember Harcourt's dealings, a few well-placed suggestions, a document or two that raises questions. She smiled, a cold and brittle thing. The seed of doubt, once planted, grows quickly in fertile soil. You risk much, Fenlo observed. If the Duke were to discover your involvement, he will not, Rowena interrupted, because you, dear Garrick, will ensure that all trails lead elsewhere. You have as much reason to see Ravenshade humbled as I do. His influence in Parliament blocks your every reform. His wealth overshadows your ambitions. Help me destroy his engagement, and when the dust settles, we shall both benefit. He will be weakened, and I, her eyes gleamed, I shall be positioned to offer comfort in his disappointment. Fenlo was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Then, slowly, he nodded. Very well, but we must proceed with absolute caution. One misstep, and we shall find ourselves the objects of his wrath. I shall make inquiries regarding Harcourt's financial dealings, quietly, and if there is anything that can be twisted to our purpose, I shall find it. Excellent, Rowena purred. Begin at once. Time is not our ally. The wedding is set for next month, and we must move before the banns are read a third time. Meanwhile, in the Duke's Grosvenor Square residence, Evelina was discovering that engagement brought its own peculiar forms of imprisonment. She had been fitted for a trousseau by the most fashionable modiste in London. Measured and pinned and draped in silks, she could scarcely believe belonged to her. Adrian had been generous to the point of extravagance, opening accounts at every establishment of note and instructing them to provide whatever she required. Yet for all the luxury suddenly at her disposal, Evelina felt increasingly isolated. Her aunt, thrilled by the match, had nonetheless retreated into the background, uncertain of her place in this new order. Evelina's few acquaintances, those who had not entirely cut her during her fall from grace, now regarded her with a mixture of envy and suspicion, and Adrian himself, though unfailingly courteous, remained as remote as the moon. She saw him daily, for propriety demanded that an engaged couple appear together at key social functions, but their conversations remained formal, even stilted. He inquired after her comfort, ensured she wanted for nothing, and escorted her to the opera and the theatre with impeccable correctness. But he did not touch her beyond what decorum required. He did not seek her thoughts on matters of consequence, and he never, ever spoke of anything resembling affection. On the evening of the third day following the announcement, they attended a dinner at the home of Sir Lucien Draymont, one of Adrian's few close friends. Sir Lucien was a cheerful man of 31, with an easy manner and a genuine warmth that put Evelina somewhat at ease. His wife, Lady Cecilia, was equally gracious, treating Evelina not as an interloper, but as a welcomed addition to their small circle. Over dessert, a confection of spun sugar and cream that seemed almost too beautiful to eat, Sir Lucien raised his glass in toast. "To the Duke and his lady," he said, his green eyes twinkling with good humour. "May your union be blessed with every happiness, and may those who doubted you choke upon their humble pie." A ripple of laughter circled the table. Adrian inclined his head, a faint smile touching his austere features. But Evelina noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tightened fractionally around the stem of his wineglass. He was anticipating something, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It came as they were preparing to depart. A footman entered with a silver salver bearing a folded note. Sir Lucien took it, his expression sobering as he read. He glanced up at Adrian, then at Evelina, uncertainty flickering across his face. "What is it?" Adrian asked quietly. "A message from Lord Fairchild at the Treasury," Sir Lucien replied. "He requests a private audience with you at your earliest convenience. He mentions—" He hesitated, then continued reluctantly, He mentions concerns regarding certain financial irregularities. It seems questions have been raised about the late Mr. James Harcourt's dealings with Crown funds. The words fell into the room like stones into water. Evelina felt the blood drain from her face. Adrian's expression did not change, but something cold and terrible entered his eyes. "When did this message arrive?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Within the hour," Sir Lucian replied. "Adrian, if there is anything I can do—" "There is nothing," Adrian said curtly. He stood, offering his hand to Evelina. "We are leaving. Miss Harcourt requires rest." Evelina rose on trembling legs, her mind reeling. Financial irregularities, Crown funds. The words were daggers aimed at her father's memory, and by extension at her own honor. She knew her father had been careless, even reckless, but never dishonest, never criminal. The carriage ride back to Grosvenor Square was conducted in suffocating silence. Evelina sat rigidly upright, her hands clenched in her lap, tears threatening to spill but held at bay through sheer force of will. Adrian stared out the window, his profile illuminated intermittently by passing street lamps. When they arrived, he handed her down from the carriage with his usual courtesy, but his touch was brief, almost cold. "Your Grace," she began, her voice barely steady, "whatever these accusations are, I swear to you my father was not—" "We shall discuss it tomorrow," Adrian interrupted, "after I have spoken with Fairchild and ascertained the nature of these concerns. Do not distress yourself tonight, Miss Harcourt. Such matters are often little more than clerical errors or malicious rumor." But his tone suggested he believed neither explanation. He bowed, formal and distant, and watched as she ascended the steps into the house. The door closed between them. Evelina stood in the grand entrance hall, surrounded by marble and gilt, and felt more alone than she had in her aunt's shabby parlour. Somewhere in the city, Lady Rowena smiled into her wine-glass. The first seed was planted. Now she need only wait for it to bear poisonous fruit. The clock struck midnight. The die was cast. Morning came grey and cold, the sort of dawn that offered no promises of better things. Evelina rose early, her sleep having been fractured by dreams of courtrooms and accusations, of her father's face pale with shame. She dressed with care in a morning gown of dove grey, subdued, respectable, the uniform of a woman who had nothing to hide. Yet her hands trembled as she fastened the buttons, and the pearls at her throat felt heavier than usual, as though her mother's ghost pressed down upon her shoulders in silent judgment. The breakfast room was empty, save for a single footman, who informed her that His Grace had departed at dawn for the Treasury offices. No message, no note, simply gone, as though she were an afterthought in her own scandal. Evelina took tea and toast she could not taste, staring at the damask wallpaper until the pattern blurred before her eyes. She had expected this, had she not? Adrian had warned her he was not a man built for warmth, but she had not anticipated how his coldness would feel when she needed reassurance most. She was still sitting there, the tea grown cold in her cup, when the butler entered with a card upon his silver tray. "Lady Cecilia Draymont to see you, Miss Harcourt." "Shall I show her in?" Evelina straightened, surprise momentarily displacing her anxiety. "Yes, of course. The morning room, I think. It has better light." Lady Cecilia arrived in a rustle of amber silk, her kind face creased with concern. She took Evelina's hands in hers without preamble, squeezing them with genuine warmth. "My dear girl, Lucian told me what happened last evening. I came at once. You should not be alone at such a time." Tears, treacherous and unwelcome, pricked at Evelina's eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. "You are kind, Lady Cecilia, but I fear there is little anyone can do. If these accusations gain traction, if evidence, false or otherwise, is produced, then the Duke will have no choice but to—" "Nonsense," Cecilia interrupted firmly. "Adrian Davenport is many things, but a coward is not among them. He chose you knowing your circumstances. He will not abandon you at the first sign of scandal. Though I grant you," she added with a wry smile, "he might go about his support in a frustratingly stoic manner. The man has all the emotional expressiveness of a marble statue." Despite everything, Evelina felt a small, surprised laugh escape her. "That is an apt description, is it not?" Cecilia settled into a chair, arranging her skirts with practiced ease. "I have known Adrian since he was a boy. He was always thus, contained, controlled, as though showing emotion were a breach of some personal code, but beneath that icy exterior beats a heart more loyal than most. If he has pledged himself to you, he will not break that pledge, though he may test your patience grievously in the meantime." Evelina wanted to believe her, but doubt, once seeded, grew quickly. "What if he discovers something damning about my father? What if there is truth beneath these accusations?" "Then you face it together," Cecilia said simply. "Marriage, even one born of convenience rather than romance, is a partnership. You do not bear your burdens alone anymore, Evelina, though Adrian may need reminding of that fact from time to time. Before Evelina could respond, the butler reappeared, his expression carefully neutral. Miss Harcourt, a Mr. Theodore Grimsby has called. He presents himself as a solicitor representing certain creditors of the late Mr. James Harcourt. He wishes to speak with you on a matter of urgency. Evelina felt ice slide down her spine. "Show him to the library," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She turned to Cecilia. "Will you remain? I find I do not wish to face this alone." "Of course," Cecilia replied, rising at once. "Let us see what this vulture wants." The library was a masculine room, all dark wood and leather, smelling of tobacco and old books. Mr. Grimsby stood by the window, a thin man in sober black, his face pinched and pale, as though he spent too much time in windowless offices. He bowed as the ladies entered, but there was something oily in the gesture, something that made Evelina's skin crawl. "Miss Harcourt," he began, his voice reedy and unpleasant, "I shall come directly to the point, as I know your time is valuable. My clients have recently come into possession of certain documents, ledgers from your late father's banking house, which suggest irregularities in his handling of Crown investments, specifically sums that were meant to be held in trust, but which appear to have been diverted." "Diverted?" Evelina repeated, her voice cold. "You mean embezzled?" Grimsby spread his hands in a gesture of false regret. "I would not use so harsh a term without conclusive proof, but the documents are troubling. My clients are prepared to present them to the Treasury and, if necessary, to the courts, unless, of course, restitution can be made." "Restitution," Evelina said slowly. "You are attempting to extort me." "I am attempting," Grimsby corrected primly, "to resolve a matter quietly before it becomes a public scandal. The sums in question are considerable. £30,000 to be precise. If such a sum were to be paid to my clients, they would be willing to forego any legal action and would destroy the documents in question. £30,000. A fortune. More than Evelina could comprehend, let alone produce. She felt dizzy, as though the room had tilted beneath her feet, but before she could speak, Cecilia's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Your clients, Mr. Grimsby, are cowards who hide behind a hired mouthpiece. And you, sir, are attempting to blackmail a woman on the eve of her marriage to one of the most powerful men in England. I suggest you reconsider your position before His Grace returns and decides to take a personal interest in your affairs." Grimsby's pinched face flushed. "Lady Cecilia, I assure you this is a legitimate legal matter." "It is extortion dressed in legal language," Cecilia snapped, "and we shall not be intimidated. You may inform your mysterious clients that any documents they possess should be presented through proper channels to the Treasury. If they are genuine, the matter will be investigated appropriately. If they are forgeries, and I suspect they are, then those responsible will face the full weight of the law. Now remove yourself from this house before I have you thrown out bodily." Grimsby sputtered, but Cecilia's imperious glare brooked no argument. He gathered his hat and case with trembling hands and fled, the library door slamming behind him. In the sudden silence, Evelina sank into a chair, her composure finally crumbling. "They will destroy me," she whispered. "Even if the documents are false, the scandal alone will be sufficient. Adrian will be forced to choose between his honor and his engagement, and I cannot ask him to sacrifice his position for my sake." Cecilia knelt before her, taking her cold hands. "You are not asking. He chose this. He chose you. And if you think he will bow to blackmailers and cowards, then you do not yet know the man you are to marry." As if summoned by her words, the door opened. Adrian stood on the threshold, his greatcoat still damp from the streets, his face a mask of controlled fury. Behind him stood another man, older, with silver hair and shrewd eyes, whom Evelina did not recognize. "I passed Grimsby on the steps," Adrian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "He looked as though the hounds of hell were at his heels. I trust he did not distress you overmuch, Miss Harcourt?" Evelina rose on unsteady legs. "He came with accusations and demands for money to suppress them." "Yes," Adrian said. "Lord Fairchild has apprised me of the situation." He gestured to the silver-haired man. "This is Alaric Davenforth, Earl of Thornwick, my cousin and legal advisor. We have spent the morning investigating these alleged documents, and we have discovered something rather interesting." Alaric stepped forward, his expression grave but not unkind. "The ledgers in question are forgeries, Miss Harcourt, competent ones, but forgeries nonetheless. The handwriting, though superficially similar to your father's, contains inconsistencies. More tellingly, the dates referenced in the documents correspond to a period when your father was provably elsewhere, in Scotland, recovering from illness. He could not have conducted the transactions described. Evelina felt the room sway. Then my father is exonerated. He was never guilty in the first place, Adrian said. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to manufacture evidence against him. The question is, who stands to gain from your disgrace? Cecilia's eyes narrowed. Lady Rowena. Adrian's expression did not change, but something cold and implacable entered his gaze. Indeed, I have already set inquiries in motion. If she is behind this, and I believe she is, then she has made a grave miscalculation. No one threatens what is mine with impunity. The words hung in the air, stark and possessive. Evelina looked up at him, this man who had offered her partnership without love, protection without warmth, and she saw for the first time the depth of his determination. He would not bend, would not break, would not surrender an inch to those who sought to humiliate her. What do we do? She asked softly. Adrian's smile was sharp as a blade. We go to war. The days that followed were a masterclass in strategic warfare, waged beneath the veneer of social civility. Adrian moved with the precision of a general marshalling his forces, calling in favors, dispatching letters, conducting meetings behind closed doors with men whose names carried weight in Parliament and the courts. Evelina found herself both spectator and participant in a campaign she barely understood, but felt in every glance, every whispered conversation that ceased when she entered a room. Lady Rowena, for her part, maintained her public facade. She attended teas and soirees, smiled behind her fan and murmured sympathy for poor Miss Harcourt, caught in such unfortunate circumstances. But her eyes glittered with triumph, and she moved through the drawing rooms of Mayfair like a queen, surveying conquered territory. She did not yet know that the ground beneath her feet had already begun to crumble. It was Sir Lucien who uncovered the first critical piece of evidence. He appeared at Grosvenor Square one fog-shrouded evening, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by grim satisfaction. Adrian received him in his study, with Evelina and Alaric present as witnesses to whatever revelation he carried. "I have something you need to see," Lucien said without preamble, producing a sheaf of papers from inside his coat. "I took the liberty of investigating Theodore Grimsby, the solicitor who called upon Miss Harcourt. His practice is small, undistinguished, and perpetually on the brink of insolvency. However, 3 weeks ago, he received a rather substantial payment, £500, from an account held in the name of Lady Rowena Blythe's brother, Lord Edmund Blythe." Adrian took the papers, scanning them with fierce concentration. Edmund Blythe died 2 years ago in a hunting accident. The account should have been closed. It was not, Lucien replied, and it has been used intermittently since his death for various transactions, all discreetly managed by a clerk at Coutts Bank who happens to be distantly related to the Blythe family steward. I believe Lady Rowena has been using her dead brother's account to conceal financial dealings she does not wish traced to herself. "Can we prove she paid Grimsby?" Alaric asked sharply. "Not directly," Lucien admitted, "but the timing is suggestive, and if we can connect her to the forger who created the false ledgers, we shall have her." He paused, his expression darkening. "There is something else. Lord Fenlo has been seen in private conference with Lady Rowena on multiple occasions over the past fortnight. I believe he is her accomplice in this scheme. He has motive. Your political influence blocks his ambitions at every turn, Adrian, and he has means, access to treasury clerks who could be bribed to plant false documents." Adrian was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the desk in a rare display of agitation. Then he looked up, his grey eyes cold as winter stone. "If Fenlo is involved, then this is not merely about wounded vanity. He seeks to undermine my position in Parliament, to weaken my influence by association with scandal. He has miscalculated, badly." "What will you do?" Evelina asked quietly. She had remained silent throughout the exchange, listening to the machinations of power politics with a growing sense of unreality. This was the world she had entered by accepting Adrian's proposal, a world where reputation was currency and enemies struck from shadows. Adrian turned to her, and for a moment his expression softened by the merest fraction. "I will do what must be done, but first we need proof. Lucien, continue your investigation of Grimsby and the Blythe account. Alaric, I want you to examine every document Fenlo has presented to the Treasury in the past year. Look for irregularities, anything that might suggest he has fabricated evidence before. If he has done this once, he may have done it previously." "And what of Lady Rowena?" Cecilia asked. She had arrived shortly after Lucien, her presence a quiet source of support for Evelina. "She will not remain idle. She believes she is winning. Then we shall let her continue to believe so, Adrian replied. Until the moment we strike. There is a Queen's Assembly in 1 week's time. Every member of the nobility will be present. It will be the perfect stage for her humiliation and our vindication. The week that followed was an agony of waiting. Evelina felt as though she were walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss, every step precarious, every breath measured. She appeared at Adrian's side at the requisite social functions, playing her role with a grace she did not feel. They attended the opera, where Lady Rowena sat in a nearby box and smiled at them with poisonous sweetness. They dined with members of Parliament, where Lord Fenlo made polite conversation while his eyes calculated odds and angles. Through it all, Adrian remained her constant. He did not speak words of comfort, that was not his nature, but his presence was steady, unyielding. When her courage faltered, he offered his arm. When the whispers grew too loud, he silenced them with a single cold glance, and slowly, imperceptibly, Evelina felt something shift between them. The contract they had entered began to feel less like a transaction and more like a partnership forged in fire. 2 nights before the assembly, they sat together in the library, reviewing Alaric's findings. The evidence was damning. Fenlo had indeed presented falsified documents to the Treasury on at least 2 previous occasions, each designed to discredit his political rivals. The pattern was clear, but proving his involvement in the current scheme remained elusive. "We need a confession," Alaric said bluntly, "or a witness willing to testify. Without one or the other, we have circumstantial evidence only, suggestive, but not conclusive." Adrian nodded slowly, then he turned to Evelina. "There is one option that may force his hand, but it will require courage on your part, and it may be unpleasant." Evelina met his gaze steadily. "Tell me." "I propose we attend Lady Rowena's card party tomorrow evening. It is a small, intimate gathering, 30 guests at most. Fenlo will be there. He has been seen with her too often to absent himself now. I believe if we appear vulnerable, if we give them reason to think we are on the verge of capitulation, they may grow careless, overconfident, and in that moment of carelessness they may reveal themselves." "You want to use me as bait," Evelina said quietly. "I want to give you the opportunity to reclaim your dignity," Adrian corrected. "This is not a decision I can make for you. If you refuse, we shall find another way, but if you agree—" He paused, his expression unreadable. "Then I promise you this, I will not let you face them alone. Whatever happens, we face it together." The words echoed Cecilia's earlier assurance. Together. It was a word Evelina had not associated with marriage when she accepted Adrian's proposal, but now, in this moment, it felt like the only word that mattered. "I will do it," she said. "Tell me what you need from me." Adrian's expression remained impassive, but she saw something flicker in his eyes, respect perhaps, or gratitude. "Tomorrow evening, you will appear fragile, uncertain, as though the weight of scandal is breaking you. I will play the role of the Duke who begins to question his choice. We shall create the illusion of fracture, and we shall see who moves to exploit it." The plan was set, the die cast. Evelina retired to her chambers that night and stood before the mirror, staring at her reflection. The woman who looked back at her was no longer the girl who had stumbled over broken glass in Lady Pemberton's ballroom. She had been tested by fire and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. She touched the pearls at her throat, her mother's legacy, and she thought of another legacy, the one she would forge for herself. Not as a victim of circumstance, but as a woman who faced her enemies with open eyes and unbowed head. Tomorrow, the masquerade would begin, and when it ended, the truth would stand revealed in all its terrible glory. The candles burned low. The clock struck midnight, and Evelina Harcourt prepared for war. Lady Rowena's townhouse blazed with candlelight, every window a golden eye watching the arriving guests. The card party was an exercise in studied elegance, intimate enough to foster conspiracy, grand enough to display wealth. Evelina descended from Adrian's carriage with her hand upon his arm, feeling the weight of every gaze that turned toward them. She had dressed with deliberate care in a gown of pale lavender silk, the color of morning's final stage. Her mother's pearls lay against her throat, and her face bore the careful pallor of sleeplessness artfully enhanced with powder. She looked, in short, like a woman on the verge of collapse. Adrian, by contrast, wore his usual impenetrable mask. His evening dress was flawless, his posture military straight, but Evelina had learned to read the subtle signs of tension in him, the tightness at the corners of his mouth, the way his hand at her waist pressed slightly harder than necessary. He was coiled tight as a spring, ready to strike. They entered together, and the murmur of conversation dimmed, then swelled like a wave. Lady Rowena materialized from the crowd, resplendent in ruby silk that matched the triumph in her eyes. Your Grace, she purred, curtsying low. And Miss Harcourt, how brave of you to attend this evening given the circumstances. I do admire courage, even when it borders on folly. Lady Rowena, Adrian replied, his voice courteous but cold. We would not miss it. Your gatherings are always so illuminating. The barb, if she caught it, did not dim her smile. Do come in. Cards are set up in the drawing room, and there is champagne in the library. I trust you shall find the evening most diverting. They moved through the crowd, Adrian's hand never leaving Evelina's elbow. She caught fragments of conversation, veiled references to scandal, speculation about the wedding, whispers about Treasury investigations. Lord Fenlo stood near the fireplace, his dark eyes tracking their progress with predatory interest. He was dressed impeccably, his every gesture calculated to project confidence and authority. As they approached, he stepped forward with a bow. Your Grace, Miss Harcourt, I trust you are enjoying the evening. Tolerably, Adrian replied, though I confess my mind is elsewhere. Financial matters have a way of consuming one's attention. Fenlo's expression arranged itself into sympathetic concern. Indeed, I understand the Treasury has been most thorough in their recent inquiries. Such things must be distressing for Miss Harcourt, given her father's history. Evelina felt Adrian stiffen beside her. This was the moment they had planned for. She let her composure slip just slightly, her eyes dropping to the floor, her hand trembling where it rested on Adrian's arm. It has been difficult, she whispered, to have my father's memory so maligned, to face such accusations when I cannot defend him. Of course, Fenlo murmured, moving closer. It must weigh heavily upon you both. One wonders if perhaps, he paused delicately, if perhaps it might be wiser to postpone the wedding until these matters are resolved. For the sake of his Grace's reputation, you understand. Adrian's expression grew shuttered. You suggest I abandon my betrothed at the first hint of scandal, Fenlo. I suggest, Fenlo replied smoothly, that a man of your position must consider the broader implications. The Treasury's investigation is unlikely to simply disappear. If evidence emerges— What evidence? Adrian interrupted, his voice sharp. Speak plainly, Fenlo. What have you heard? Fenlo glanced around, then lowered his voice. There are documents, ledgers that suggest significant irregularities in Harcourt's management of Crown funds. I have seen them myself, in my capacity on the Treasury Oversight Committee. They are damning, Your Grace. If they are presented publicly, Miss Harcourt's family name will be destroyed beyond redemption, and yours alongside it if you proceed with this marriage. Evelina made a small, choked sound. It was not entirely feigned. The casual cruelty in Fenlo's tone struck like a physical blow. Adrian's hand tightened on her arm, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of barely leashed fury. If such documents exist, then they should be examined by proper authorities, not wielded as weapons of gossip. But they have been examined, Fenlo replied, by Treasury officials, by investigators. The conclusion is inescapable. James Harcourt was, at best, criminally negligent, at worst, a deliberate embezzler. Surely you do not wish to ally yourself with such a legacy. And surely, came a new voice, crisp and female, you do not wish to be caught in a lie before witnesses. Every head turned. Lady Cecilia Draymont stood in the doorway, Sir Lucien beside her. But it was the man behind them who commanded attention, a tall figure in the severe dress of a high-ranking government official, his expression grave and unyielding. Lord Harrington, Fenlo said, his face draining of colour. I did not expect— No, Lord Harrington replied, stepping forward. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, second only to the Prime Minister in financial authority. I imagine you did not, but His Grace thought it prudent to invite me, given the nature of the accusations being levelled. I have spent the past 3 days conducting my own investigation into the documents you referenced, Lord Fenlo. Would you care to know what I discovered? Fenlo's mouth opened, then closed. Around them, the other guests had fallen silent, sensing blood in the water. The documents are forgeries, Harrington continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Competent ones, certainly, but forgeries nonetheless. The ink, when analysed, proved to be of a formulation not available until 2 years after James Harcourt's death. The handwriting, though superficially similar, contains errors no trained banker would make, and most tellingly, the transactions described reference accounts that did not exist during Harcourt's lifetime. Fenlo took a step backward, his composure cracking. That is, I was given those documents in good faith. I merely reported what I was shown. By whom? Adrian asked, his voice deadly quiet. Who gave you these documents, Fenlo? The silence stretched like a blade. Then Lady Rowena's voice cut through it, shrill with desperation. This is absurd. Lord Fenlo would never— Lady Rowena, Harrington interrupted, turning his cold gaze upon her. I would advise you to remain silent. My investigation uncovered not only the forgeries, but also a rather illuminating paper trail. Payments made from your late brother's account to a solicitor named Theodore Grimsby. Further payments to a clerk at the Treasury offices, a man who has since confessed to planting the false documents at your instruction in exchange for funds to pay his gambling debts. The room erupted. Gasps and exclamations rippled through the assembled guests. Lady Rowena's face transformed from smug confidence to ashen horror in the space of a heartbeat. She swayed, grasping the back of a chair for support. "No," she whispered. "No, you cannot." "Can and have," Harrington replied implacably. "The evidence is conclusive, Lady Rowena. You conspired with Lord Fenlo to fabricate accusations against the late James Harcourt and his daughter, with the intent of preventing the Duke's marriage. You suborned a government official. You attempted extortion through proxy. These are serious crimes, madam. Crimes that carry significant penalties." Fenlo made a sudden movement toward the door, but Sir Lucian was faster. He stepped into the Lord's path, his usually cheerful face set in hard lines. "I would not advise flight, Fenlo. There are constables waiting in the street, courtesy of His Grace's forethought." Adrian moved forward, and the crowd parted before him as before a king. He stopped before Lady Rowena, looking down at her with no trace of mercy in his grey eyes. "You sought to destroy the woman I have chosen to marry," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room. "You thought you could manipulate me through scandal and lies. You were wrong." He turned, extending his hand toward Evelina. She took it, her head high, her spine straight. Together they stood before the assembled company, before friends and enemies alike, united in a tableau that would be remembered and recounted in drawing rooms for years to come. "Let it be known," Adrian continued, his voice ringing with authority, "that Miss Evelina Harcourt is innocent of all accusations. Her father's name is cleared, and any who question her honor or my choice will answer to me personally. We shall be married as planned, and this matter is closed." Lord Harrington nodded his approval. "Constable," he called toward the door, "please escort Lord Fenlo and Lady Rowena to custody. They shall face charges in due course." As the constables entered and the guilty parties were led away, Fenlo rigid with fury, Rowena sobbing behind her hands, the remaining guests broke into applause. It was tentative at first, then swelling to genuine enthusiasm. The tide had turned. The battle was won. Evelina felt tears prick at her eyes, but these were tears of relief, of vindication. Adrian's hand tightened around hers, and she looked up to find him watching her with an expression she had never seen before, something almost like tenderness beneath the habitual reserve. "Well done," he murmured, too low for others to hear. "You were magnificent." "We were," she corrected softly, "together." His lips curved in the faintest of smiles. Then he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that felt for the first time like a promise. Outside, the London night settled over the city, indifferent to the small dramas of humanity. But within Lady Rowena's townhouse, soon to be sold to settle her legal debts, a new chapter had begun, one written in truth rather than lies, in partnership rather than manipulation. And in the days to come, all of London would know the Duke of Ravenshade had chosen his bride. And heaven help anyone foolish enough to challenge that choice. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, a rarity in London's typically grey autumn. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Grosvenor Square, gilding the marble floors and setting the crystal chandeliers ablaze with captured rainbows. Evelina woke early, her heart a curious mixture of anticipation and calm. The storm had passed, the enemies vanquished. Today she would become a duchess. Not through manipulation or desperation, but through choice freely made on both sides. Her chambers had been transformed overnight by an army of maids. Wedding gifts covered every surface, silver tea services, porcelain figurines, jeweled ornaments sent by nobility eager to curry favor, now that the scandal had been definitively quashed. But Evelina's eyes went immediately to the single item that mattered, her wedding gown, hanging near the window where morning light made the ivory silk seem to glow from within. Lady Cecilia arrived as Evelina was finishing her breakfast, sweeping in with her usual warmth and a small velvet box tucked under one arm. "Good morning, bride-to-be," she said cheerfully, kissing Evelina's cheek. "I come bearing gifts and gossip in equal measure. Which would you prefer first?" "Gossip," Evelina replied with a small smile. "Always gossip," Cecilia laughed, settling into a chair with obvious relish. "Very well. Lady Rowena has been stripped of her social standing and barred from court indefinitely. Her family has disowned her to protect their own reputation. She is to retire to a country estate in Yorkshire, a draughty, uncomfortable place, I'm told, where she will live out her days in obscurity. Lord Fenlo faces criminal charges and will likely spend several years in debtor's prison once his assets are seized to pay restitution. His political career, needless to say, is finished. I should feel triumph, Evelina said slowly, but instead I feel only weariness. They destroyed themselves through their own malice. That is because you have a kind heart, Cecilia replied. Adrian chose well, which brings me to my gift. She opened the velvet box, revealing a delicate tiara of diamonds and sapphires, the stones set in platinum so fine it looked like lace. This belonged to Adrian's mother, the late Duchess. He asked me to present it to you this morning with his compliments. He said, and I quote, "A duchess requires a crown, even a symbolic one." Evelina's breath caught. The tiara was exquisite, clearly worth a fortune, but it was the gesture that moved her. Adrian had given her his mother's jewels, a symbol of acceptance into his family, of legitimacy beyond question. She reached out with trembling fingers to touch the cool stones. He also asked me to tell you, Cecilia continued more softly, that his mother would have liked you very much. She was a woman of great courage and greater compassion, rather like someone else I know. Tears threatened, but Evelina blinked them back. There would be time for emotion later. Now there was a wedding to prepare for. The transformation took hours. The gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk and Brussels lace, fitted to perfection, with a train that would require 2 attendants to manage. Her hair was dressed high and crowned with the Duchess's tiara. Pearls, her mother's pearls, lay against her throat. When she finally looked at herself in the full-length mirror, Evelina barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked regal, powerful, every inch, a duchess. St. George's, Hanover Square, was already packed when her carriage arrived. Every pew held nobility or gentry, all dressed in their finest, all craning for a glimpse of the controversial bride. The scandal had only heightened interest. Evelina's vindication had transformed her from object of pity to romantic heroine in the public imagination. As she stood in the narthex, waiting for the processional to begin, she could hear the murmur of hundreds of voices, the rustle of silk and satin, the expectant hush that precedes great moments. Her Aunt Margot was there, resplendent in purple silk, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Sir Lucien stood as one of Adrian's groomsmen, his cheerful face solemn for once. And at the altar, tall and commanding in formal black, stood Adrian Davenforth, Duke of Ravenshade, waiting for his bride. The organs swelled, the congregation rose as one, and Evelina began the long walk down the aisle, her train whispering against marble, her head high beneath the weight of her borrowed crown. She saw faces she recognized. Some kind, some merely curious, some still bearing traces of the disdain they had shown her weeks before, but she did not look at them. Her eyes were fixed on the man at the altar, and as she drew closer, she saw something in his expression that made her heart leap. He was not simply waiting, he was watching her with something very like wonder, as though seeing her for the first time. When she reached him and placed her hand in his fingers closed around hers with gentle strength. The ceremony was traditional, steeped in centuries of Anglican ritual. They spoke their vows clearly, Adrian's voice steady and sure, Evelina's surprisingly firm despite the enormity of the moment. When the bishop pronounced them man and wife, Adrian lifted her veil with careful deliberation. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then he leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was proper, restrained, appropriate for the setting. But beneath the propriety, Evelina felt promise and possibility. The congregation erupted in applause. Church bells began to peal across London, and the new Duke and Duchess of Ravenshade turned to face their world, united at last. The wedding breakfast at Grosvenor Square was a magnificent affair. Champagne flowed like water. Musicians played in the ballroom. Guests who had snubbed Evelina weeks before now competed to offer congratulations and curry favor. She moved through it all with Adrian at her side, learning the subtle art of being a duchess, how to smile without warmth, how to accept compliments without believing them, how to wield social power with the precision of a surgeon's blade. But it was late in the evening, after most guests had departed and only the closest friends remained, that the moment Evelina would remember most clearly occurred. She and Adrian stood on the terrace overlooking the garden, the night air cool and clean, the stars visible through gaps in the London smoke. "Are you content?" Adrian asked quietly. It was perhaps the first truly personal question he had asked her all day. Evelina considered before answering. "I am hopeful," she said at last. We have weathered much in a very short time, but I do not yet know what we shall be to each other once the drama has faded and ordinary life resumes." Adrian was silent for a moment. Then he said, "When I was a boy, my father told me that the measure of a man was not how he behaved in victory, but how he stood in adversity. You stood magnificently, Evelina. You did not crumble. You did not beg for mercy or seek escape. You faced your enemies with courage I have rarely seen in any man, let alone a woman society had deemed powerless." He turned to face her fully, his grey eyes serious in the moonlight. "I told you I could not promise you love. I believed that to be true. But I find that I must revise that statement. I do not know if what I feel is love. I have no experience with which to compare it. But I know that I admire you, that I respect you beyond measure, and that I find myself wanting to be worthy of the trust you have placed in me." Evelina's throat tightened with emotion. "Adrian, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I am not a man of easy affection. That will not change. But I give you my word. I shall endeavor to be not merely a husband in name, but a partner in truth. Your victories shall be mine. Your sorrows I shall share. And if love grows from that foundation, then we shall welcome it. But even without it, we shall build something worth having, something real." Evelina reached up, touching his cheek with wonder. He did not flinch away. Instead, he turned his head slightly, pressing a kiss to her palm, a gesture more intimate than anything that had passed between them before. "Then let us build it together," she whispered. "Whatever comes, we face it side by side." "Side by side," he agreed. And in the garden below, a nightingale began to sing, its voice piercing the darkness with beauty and promise. The stars wheeled overhead. London slept, and the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshade stood together on the threshold of their shared future, no longer strangers bound by convenience but partners forged in fire. Whatever the world might bring, they would face it as they had faced everything else, with courage, with honor, and with the unshakable certainty that they were stronger together than they could ever be alone. Spring came to London with uncharacteristic gentleness, painting the parks with daffodils and primroses, coaxing the plane trees into tender leaf. 6 months had passed since the wedding that had set society ablaze with gossip and speculation. 6 months in which Evelina Davenforth, Duchess of Ravenshade, had proven herself more than equal to the role she had assumed. She stood now in the drawing-room of Grosvenor Square, reviewing correspondence with her secretary, a competent young woman named Miss Hartley, whom Evelina had hired over Adrian's initial objections. The objection had not lasted long. Adrian had learned that when Evelina made up her mind about something, she possessed a will of iron wrapped in velvet courtesy. "The applications for the Harcourt Foundation have doubled this month," Miss Hartley reported, sorting through a stack of letters. "We have requests from 12 families seeking educational grants, and the new lending library in Whitechapel has asked if we might fund the purchase of additional books." "Approve them all," Evelina said without hesitation. "My father's name was dragged through scandal he did not deserve. Let his legacy now be one of helping others avoid the poverty that destroys dignity and hope." The Harcourt Foundation had been Adrian's wedding gift to her, a charitable trust funded with £30,000, the exact sum Lord Fenlo and Lady Rowena had attempted to extort. Evelina had poured herself into its management, establishing lending libraries, funding education for impoverished children, and providing interest-free loans to respectable families fallen on hard times. It had become her passion and her purpose, transforming her from society ornament to genuine force for good. "Your Grace," Miss Hartley said hesitantly, "there is one more item, an invitation to tea from Lady Pemberton, the same Lady Pemberton in whose ballroom you were humiliated," Evelina finished calmly. "Yes, I remember. What does she want?" "She does not say, but the tone is conciliatory, almost apologetic," Evelina considered. 6 months ago she would have refused such an invitation out of hand, but she had learned that power wielded with grace was more effective than power wielded with vengeance. "Accept," she said. "Schedule it for Thursday afternoon. And, Miss Hartley, prepare a full report on the Foundation's activities. I suspect Lady Pemberton is seeking to attach herself to our charitable work now that it has become fashionable." Miss Hartley smiled, a knowing glint in her eye. "Very good, Your Grace." After the secretary departed, Evelina moved to the window, gazing out at the square below. A carriage drew up before the house, Adrian's carriage, returning from Parliament, where he had been engaged in debate over reform legislation. She watched him descend, his tall figure unmistakable, his movements precise as always. But now she could read the subtle signs of fatigue in the set of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. He found her in the drawing room moments later, loosening his cravat with visible relief. "The session was interminable," he said by way of greeting. Lord Ashford spoke for 45 minutes about agricultural tariffs without once making a coherent point. I began to contemplate self-inflicted injury as a means of escape. Evelina laughed, moving to pour him brandy from the sideboard. "Poor darling. Shall I have cook prepare something soothing for dinner? Roasted chicken, perhaps?" "Anything but speeches," Adrian replied, accepting the glass and sinking into his favorite chair. Then he seemed to register her words, and something softened in his expression. "You called me darling." "Did I?" Evelina feigned innocence, though warmth crept into her cheeks. "How careless of me." "Not careless," Adrian said quietly. "Welcome." In the month since their marriage, something unexpected had blossomed between them. Not the passionate romance of novels, neither of them possessed temperaments suited to grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but something steadier, deeper, a partnership that had grown into genuine affection, then into something neither of them had quite dared to name. They had learned each other's rhythms and preferences, Adrian's need for solitude after difficult days, Evelina's habit of reading late into the night, requiring a lamp kept burning in the library, the way Adrian's rare smiles transformed his austere features, the way Evelina's laughter could coax him from his darkest moods. They had become, without quite meaning to, essential to each other. "There is news," Adrian said, setting down his glass. "Lady Rowena petitioned for permission to return to London. The petition was denied. She remains in Yorkshire, and by all accounts she is thoroughly miserable. Her family has cut her off entirely." "I almost pity her," Evelina said softly, "to have had everything and thrown it away for spite." "You are more generous than she deserves," Adrian replied. "But that is one of the things I—" He paused, then continued more deliberately. "One of the things I love about you." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Evelina went very still, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. "What did you say?" Adrian rose, moving to stand before her. For once the mask of control had slipped, revealing genuine vulnerability beneath. "I said I love you. I have been trying to find the courage to say it for weeks. I am not a man accustomed to admitting such things, but you deserve to know. You have made me—" He paused, searching for words. "You have made me more than I was, better than I believed I could be. And I find that I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Tears gathered in Evelina's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "I did not expect to. I thought we would remain cordial strangers sharing a household. But somewhere between the scandal and the vindication, between the battles fought and the victories won, I fell in love with you, with your strength and your honor, and even your terrible stoicism that makes you so difficult to read." Adrian cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. "Then we are both fools who found wisdom in unexpected places." He kissed her then, not with the restrained propriety of their wedding day, but with genuine feeling, tenderness and desire, and the promise of all the days to come. When they finally drew apart, both were breathless, both smiling with the wonder of it. "We should celebrate," Evelina said, her voice unsteady. "Open champagne, make some grand gesture." "Orson," Adrian suggested, his rare smile warming his grey eyes. "We could simply be together, without spectacle or ceremony. Just us." "Just us," Evelina agreed, leaning into his embrace. "That sounds perfect." They stood together in the drawing room as afternoon faded into evening, the spring sunlight gilding them both. Outside, London carried on its endless dance of commerce and society, scandal and triumph. But here, in this moment, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshade had found something far more valuable than social standing or wealth. They had found each other, not through the fairy tale romance of ballads and stories, but through fire and adversity, through choice made and kept, through the slow building of trust that became respect, that became, against all odds, love. On the mantelpiece, a small portrait caught the light, a gift from Sir Lucian, painted at the wedding. It showed them side by side, formal and dignified, every inch the aristocratic couple, but if one looked closely, one could see their hands clasped between them, hidden in the folds of Evelina's gown, a private gesture, a secret promise. And in the years to come, when their story was told and retold in drawing rooms and assembly halls, people would speak of the scandal and the vindication, the forged documents and the public triumph. But those who knew them best, Cecilia and Lucienne, Alaric and Miss Hartley, knew the real story, the one that mattered. It was not the story of a duke who rescued a woman from poverty. It was the story of two people who rescued each other from loneliness, who built from a contract something real and lasting and true, who proved that love need not arrive in a thunderclap, but can grow quietly, steadily, like spring returning after the harshest winter. The candles were lit against the gathering darkness. Dinner was announced, and the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshade, hands still clasped, walked together toward whatever the future might hold, secure in the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, always together.